sexual abuse as well. So for the film Dolores Claiborne, we have abuse as a central theme. We have an identified character in Joe, and we have a dyad with his wife where there is physical and emotional abuse, and then yet another dyad, same family, with Selena, his daughter, emotional, physical, and now even sexual abuse. With that history, and let's keep focus on the eponymous character of Dolores. What signs and symptoms are we observing that we think might be a result of this abuse?
The symptom, like, I feel like it's so point blank, but like so obvious, but the literal signs of physical abuse when he hits her. And then on top of it, another sign would be the separate bank account for Selena and them trying to run away. So she's trying to leave the situation so that it's no longer a toxic household. Another would be making sure that the daughter doesn't see any of it so that she's not harmed psychologically.
Yeah, and that's really the story here, is the lengths to which a mother will go to protect her daughter, even if it means that her daughter develops an opinion that estranges her. It's better to have my daughter hate me and be safe than to know the truth. And that's what Dolores undertakes here. So I mean, psychological themes of resilience from this mom's perspective. Again, the lengths a mom will take to protect her family, to protect her children, and to protect Selena.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then for another character, it would be Selena, obviously, because of her being so traumatized that she no longer has any recollection of what actually happened. And she doesn't connect that the fact that she is being prescribed all these pills for panic attacks, breakdowns, anxiety attacks, and not relating it to her past life, right?
So some combination of her own long-term memory and that which could be filled in by her mother, both are absent here. The mother is making a conscious effort not to disclose to Selena what that history is, and then Selena herself has no recollection, no recall of those past events. If Selena were to present to you in clinical practice with what might be signs and symptoms of clinical depression, right? I feel dysphoric, I feel down, I have crying spells. One of the routine questions we usually ask in the context of a routine psychiatric evaluation is a trauma history. However, when a person like Selena says, no, I've never been subjected to any trauma, there's two ways to interpret that. One is verbatim, and that it looks as if that there is no trauma history in this particular case. The other, though, is a perspective that requires a high clinical index of suspicion. That is, if a patient presents with a constellation of signs or symptoms that suggests a prior history of trauma, the self-report of there being no trauma should not be taken verbatim. Instead, one can actually consider that the more severe the trauma, not only the more likely they are to have symptoms, perhaps PTSD, but also the less likely they are to recall the trauma. So when a person says no trauma, if you're operating with a high clinical index of suspicion, that actually may be supportive of the very signs and symptoms you are seeing and observing in real time. So Selena is going to tell us that there is no trauma history. Now, on the other hand, one of the other things that psychiatrists and psychologists routinely undertake and intimately understand is the resourcing and the importance of collateral information. So we would have spoken with Dolores after a full informed consent, of course, who would then hopefully would have provided us with that history so that we can make sense of her daughter's current symptomology.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
So for collateral information, are you reaching out to Dolores even if she's over the age of 18?
If she allows us, if Selena allows us, yes.
And so from like a psychiatrist or psychologist's point of view, would you like maybe Google her? I feel like that's such a stupid way to say it, but like since like her father did die, I feel like would you be able to search up her past?
Not routinely, no. 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 We're still very traditional in the way we gain collateral information. We sign informed consent, and we speak to those people that the patient, in this case herself, allows us to speak with. And my first thought would be Dolores. And Dolores may or may not disclose the trauma history, but we certainly know that she knows it. And therefore, we also understand as a third party that she might actually fill in the gaps for us so that we can actually make an accurate diagnosis and allow for accurate treatment planning. As it stands, it seems like her daughter Selena is on multiple medications, right? Now, I have not nerded out. I might tonight, but I have not yet, meaning that I have not rewatched this film and paused it to see if the labels of those medications are legible.
I tried, I couldn't see it. It only showed like her name, really.
Yeah. And do we have an idea how many vials there are?
Like
About
10.
10. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot.
So there's a lot. There's a lot. Now, some of them can be duplicates, right? An individual may be on a couple of antidepressants, a couple of different benzodiazepines for anxiety, and perhaps even a couple of antipsychotics for psychotic features, and even a couple of mood stabilizers for the treatment of what might be considered mania. But it is unlikely that she would be on 3 of the same class of medication, even a couple of hypnotics as a sleep aid. But to be on 3 medications within the same class is highly unlikely. So if we're going to go with the limit being 2, are we going to say 10?
I would say 10.
I mean, then we're dealing with about 5 classes of medication. And even if there is one where that is a class that is having 3 meds prescribed for it, we're still dealing with 5 classes of medications, right? Because that means that there's a single med, a monotherapy out there, which covers yet another class, if my reasoning makes sense. So 5 different classes of medication. So what could they be? So let's go through these. The greatest likelihood, if we're listing classes of medications in the symptomology that we observe in Selena, certainly depression would be one. And maybe this is the one where she is actually on 3 different antidepressants. Mood stabilizers is a second class. Antipsychotics is a third class. Anti-anxiety would be a 4th class. And hypnotics would be that 5th and final class. Now we are missing stimulants, ADHD medications, which may be playing a role here. And I'm sure we could even think of others, but they would be less likely than what we have here. And if there are 3 antidepressants, my gut says is that she might be on 1 mood stabilizer plus 2 antipsychotics or a single antipsychotic plus 2 mood stabilizers. That is, there's some combination where that total could be 3.
So like I don't know if we've discussed it yet or if I just forget. What do you mean by like hypnotics?
Oh, those that's just a clinical term for sleep meds.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the only reason I would say like around 10, I feel like Dolores goes through her bag and she pulls them all out and they're all different. Like every bottle is a different color. There's like a couple blue, a couple green, maybe a couple orange, and they're all so different shapes and everything. So that's the only reason. And for anti-anxieties, would that also um be in the same category as like panic attacks? Because she has a lot of breakdowns. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it would. Even if we decided to get conservative here and say not 5, but 4 classes of medications, we still could ask ourselves, well, what might this mean? And I think the broad stroke answer is that it is much more likely that her prescriber, and maybe it's multiple prescribers, but her prescriber is prescribing for the management of symptoms instead of prescribing FDA-approved medications for known and established mental disorders. Because it's more likely that these medications are being used for symptomatic relief than it would be for her to have 4, count them, 4 separate diagnoses, each of which has 2, maybe in an instance, 3 FDA-approved medications prescribed for each.
So I have a question. What like since she deals with it like internally and subconsciously more than consciously about her past, what would be like the underlying reason for her to forget it all? Like how did she just like forget and then go home, go through it all again, and then remember it because of one incident on the boat?
Because when her father would visit her room, or when her father would have her on that boat, for a young daughter to stay in the here and now, to stay grounded, and to be consciously aware of how her dad can ask her to do or make her do the things that he did is an absolute and imminent threat to a 5 or 6-year-old. Okay, when a 5 or 6-year-old is tucked in at night, that bedroom should be the safest place in their mind. And when it is not, it is absolutely incompatible with conscious thought. So the individual has a few options, all subconscious, all part of the autonomic nervous system. Fight or flight are the first 2 options. These are mechanisms, these are functions of that subcortical or subconscious part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So if Selena fought her dad, she'd stay grounded and she'd claw her way out from underneath him. That is a process of the hypothalamus. So is flight, right? If she was able to get out of that room and run into her mother's room, run to the phone and call 911. It's another subcortical or subconscious process of the hypothalamus. However, at 4 or 5 or 6 years of age, those were not viable options. So there's another process of the hypothalamus, choice C, which is freeze. So fight, flight, now freeze. The clinical term for freeze is dissociation. That is, Selena experiences an altered state of consciousness, which allows her mind to go somewhere. So it does not remain in the here and now to process what her dad is doing. And because she is not in the here and now, and she is not processing that information, she will have no memory of that event. It's just not processed.
So since she disassociates from the abuse that she suffers, does that include that she just disassociates from her mother? Because I feel like she has some inclination that her father is bad to her mother because of like seeing the blood. She even says it, that she saw the blood on his forehead and everything. And I just don't understand how she was able to like reverse everything kind of and make her mother out to be such a villain instead of the father.
Yeah, well, what happens is that individuals who do not process the information in present time, they're going to have gaps in memory. And sometimes those gaps in memory may be filled in by or with false memories.
Okay.
So one way in which Selena could get past the absolutely threatening idea that her father would do this to her is to create false memories and put the blame on her mom.
Hmm.
Right? That's a way that could be a defense mechanism where her anger towards her dad is displaced towards her mom. And for whatever reason, there's another component of Selena's subconscious that finds that more acceptable, a more acceptable option. That process is referred to as displacement. That's the ego defense mechanism that might be playing a role on how she may have this relationship and that she may have these thoughts towards her mom and no such thoughts towards her dad. And her mom, I think in terms of character development, I think her mom is fully aware of this. And I think her mom actually maybe even decided that this was a much more favorable outcome than to have her daughter ever realize what the real imminent threat was. Let her hate me. I can deal with it. I'm her mom.
For me,
Um,
I feel like it also has to do with the fact that she feels like shame almost in the fact that she never took her daughter out of the situation.
there's certainly a lot of guilt. There's no doubt about that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And that bubbles over at the end where she's had enough, and she decides that she's gonna do something that she probably believes she should have done years ago, and that is get rid of this guy. Mhm. I mean, again, that might be a conscious thought. There might be a conscious effort there. So I certainly want to make sure we all understand that there is some cortical functioning here. However, there might be some subcortical, that is subconscious function as well. And to the extent that she does what she does with that well during that solar eclipse, that might be a form of another defense mechanism called undoing. So if Joe dies, it somehow in my mind undoes all the trauma that I allowed to have happen to my daughter years ago. So that might be playing a role here too.
Do you think that her husband dealt with previous trauma? They don't really dive into it, but I feel like someone with alcohol tendencies and who is abusive usually has a past history, right?
They certainly could. There might be a reason why he is drinking as heavy as he is. And one way to not be in the here and now is to either be high or drunk.
Mhm.
So that could be happening as well. Another role could be self-medication. So maybe he has post-traumatic stress symptoms as well, anxiety symptoms, which themselves might be addressed through sedatives, not those that are prescribed, but in a bottle. That's another role that alcohol could be playing, or could be none of the above. He could be an addict. His mom and dad could have both been addicts. He may have the genetic susceptibility to be or afflicted with alcohol use disorder, and that certainly is yet another alternative. We just don't know. And again, with these potential options on the table, a rewatch of Dolores Claiborne might actually allow us to primarily focus on this character to see if there were any hints that are provided in the film that would allow us some, some degree of understanding about his history.
Well, like the only reason I brought it up was because I feel like the only past history information that was given about him was that his family was rich and Dolores's family worked for them, like for the yacht or the boat, I think it was. So I thought like if he came from a rich background, maybe there was neglect or something from his
Could be,
parents.
I mean, certainly an issue that as a psychiatrist, we would address, right? We start off very superficial and ask if there's any family history of mental illness, but a much deeper understanding of the extended family dynamic is part of providing care. So we would definitely ask. I just don't know if we have our answer just yet.
Yeah.
But what a wonderful parallel. I mean, here's Dolores with that history of having to work for his family. But on the other hand, she's also working for a very rich woman too, who has a completely different relationship, I would suggest, compared to her mother-in-law. Right? We have someone who is much more mentoring than anything we would think that Joe's mother was to Dolores.
Mm-hmm. I just I forget her name. Vera. I feel like she comes off so mean though, for no reason. And then when it really comes down to like Dolores breaking down about finding out her daughter is being abused by her father, she finally shows affection towards Dolores. And I don't understand why she didn't to begin with. Like why she never just showed her that she cared a little bit about her. Like,
well, one consideration here is that she can't. Right? I'm not so sure that she has the capacity. Maybe, remember, there's suspicion that she killed her husband.
I feel like it's more than a suspicion. She admits to it, basically.
So if she's that type of person, maybe she's not going to be warm and fuzzy in general, and that explains why she's not warm and fuzzy and connecting with Dolores.
Yeah.
She's an absolutely complex character, and there's intent to not spoon feed us information on her, which leads us to speculate what might be her history, explaining her current behavior.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think she died?
Like how? Like, what do you mean?
What's the true cause of Vera's death?
She killed herself, basically. She killed herself.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. Basically like threw herself down the stairs and then was like begging Dolores to like, take her out of her misery or whatever. And then it was just a case of Dolores being caught at the wrong place, wrong time, with the wrong thing in her hand. But yeah.
You think she committed suicide?
Yeah.
I think so.
Basically.
Yeah.
Where are you going with this? I mean, because now you are painting this character. You are actually filling in some gaps here. And boy, is this turning out to be an incredibly compelling character. And then again, full disclosure, I did not read the book. This may be all in the book for all I know. We're focusing our discussion on the film, Dolores Claiborne. So totally absent any information provided in the novel.
I just think there wasn't any, like from what we saw, there wasn't like a lot of people who would have the motive to necessarily like kill her. And it's like, well, she had dementia, so she could have been, kind of having like, I don't want to say delusions, but being in a situation where she was like thinking that, oh, maybe there's someone in the house when there isn't, and, or being in a different kind of state of mind than she typically would be when Dolores was around.
And is it established that Vera has dementia?
I think she does kind of touch upon it, like in some of the flashbacks that she's talking to Selena. Um, but yeah.
I'd have to look. I would honestly have to look at the script and see if in fact it's written in the script. Yeah, major neurocognitive disorder, dementia. So that certainly could be playing a role, no doubt. And what's interesting is that if in review of the script of this film, there is something that establishes dementia here. What might be interesting is whether or not that's a little misguided. Instead, Vera is afflicted with pseudo-dementia. So anybody know what pseudo-dementia is? Pseudo-dementia is actually major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder that manifests in someone who is elderly will usually present with signs and symptoms that are indistinguishable from dementia. So with someone presenting to your outpatient clinic with major neurocognitive disorder, AKA dementia, you might be thinking to work up Alzheimer's disease, for example. But one of the clinical considerations that you have to keep in mind is that this may be depression, because depression in the elderly looks exactly like dementia. And if you were to treat it as depression and the condition improves, then in retrospect, you call it pseudo-dementia. That is, this was depression the whole time. That presents not with depressed mood, not with any change of appetite, etc., because in the elderly, it presents atypically, just like in children, presents atypically. And the typical way that depression presents in somebody Vera's age is as dementia through cognitive deficits. So pseudo-dementia, which will be interesting because that means that if she did throw herself down the stairs, and if this were truly a suicide attempt, connecting that with an episode of depression is fairly straightforward. Certainly individuals with this condition may attempt suicide. Not that people with dementia don't, but this might connect to pseudo-dementia, AKA major depressive disorder.
I have a question. So, like, I just don't understand how, like, it could be misdiagnosed or how you could, because isn't dementia, like, very debilitating?
So it's depression.
So, like, what are some, like, symptoms that would really make them different from each other?
Sometimes none, which is why some practitioners, many practitioners, especially in geriatric psychiatry, and again, this is a big reason why there's a fellowship, there's a subspecialty of geriatric psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
There might be some bedside tools, geriatric depression scale, for example, which focuses more on signs and symptoms other than those published in the DSM defining depression. But the bottom line is that a lot of us, including geriatric psychiatrists, will often prescribe a trial of antidepressant. And if the cognitive deficits resolve with the antidepressant dosing, that's not the way Alzheimer's disease responds. It's the way a major depressive episode responds. So that's one way to uncover. It's trial and error, whether the cognitive deficits are truly due to dementia versus pseudo-dementia, AKA major depressive disorder. It's not an easy in-office differentiation or differential. So I don't want to put down the state of Maine or that small island and the access to healthcare, the access to mental health, but it's a small town, and maybe the practicing psychiatrist there, family practitioner, doesn't have the same level of training as a geriatric psychiatrist.
And I think also, given the time period the movie was based in, that could have a factor with regards to like the research that was done then versus now. Like now, obviously, everyone knows a lot more. But also another question going along with that is, are there any other mental illnesses that could manifest as pseudodementia in the elderly?
So manifest as dementia, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, delirium would have to be high in the differential as well. But I think those are the big three. I really do think those are the big three. There, of course, are subtypes of dementia. That is, causes, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease, etc. So that's varied, but that's not an alternative to dementia. That's getting at the etiology of the subtype of. That's a little bit of a different conversation. Again, if this were truly dementia, and we had somebody fall, I'm worried about Parkinson's disease, right? Because of the abnormal gait and even the hypotensive episodes that can characterize Parkinson's. So that's a consideration here. I didn't really observe any tremor in this character, nor was I really looking for it. But that's an example of a subtype and how a subtype may be contributing to what we see here. I want to give you one other alternative. So again, we're talking about major neurocognitive disorder. We're talking about pseudo-dementia, that is major depression. I do want to build a scenario in which not all suicides are due to mental illness. This character, even though we paint her as not being warm and fuzzy, may have identified that in her death, she can save her best friend. And this may be a product of her throwing herself down the stairs so that Dolores could finally have an opportunity to exonerate herself and start anew. And that includes start anew with her daughter. She may have identified this, and she might realize that this is my legacy, right? So let's talk a little bit about this, because this gets a little controversial, because as a psychiatrist, I want to make sure I advocate for mental health. And I want to make sure that the most adverse outcome of these illnesses, suicide, is a topic that we're discussing and how to prevent it. But there are cases in which this outcome is not due to mental illness. So let's talk about the Erickson's or Ericksonian 8 stages of personality development published in his text, The 8 Stages of Man, which of course is readily applicable to 8 stages of a woman too, including Vera. I want to focus primarily on that final stage because I think given her age, that's where Vera would be right now. What I often ask to kind of review these 8 stages is what Erik Erikson's favorite color was. So I'm going to have you guys just throw out one guess. I understand nobody knows the answer, but can I get 3 guesses from the crowd?
Say yellow.
Yellow.
Pink.
Pink. And Sarah?
Blue.
Blue. It's beige. Okay. Now it's important to remember. It's also important to remember that Erik Erikson was a pretty crappy speller. He actually spelled beige, B-A-I-G-E. So it's unfortunate. But for us, it is actually fortunate because when we understand that his favorite color is misspelled beige, it gives us an acronym for the 8 stages of man, right? There are 4 I's, right? So that completes 8, right? B-A-I-I-I-I-G-E. At the end of our conversation later on tonight, you guys can look up those stages. I'm going to focus on the E because that's the final stage. The E localizes to older age. This is Vera. It's called ego integrity. Ego integrity, if an individual does not achieve ego integrity, one of the potential outcomes per Erikson is despair, is depression. And up until this point, maybe Vera has not achieved ego integrity. Maybe Vera does not believe she has put her fingerprints on this world. And if she were to die and if she's looking at the inevitable death, she has nothing to leave or that would leave her name behind. And maybe she is in despair, per Erickson, and maybe she is depressed, and maybe she has pseudo-dementia. Now, is her fall down the stairs then a suicide attempt due to despair / depression? Or is it her conscious effort to achieve ego integrity? Because by falling down those stairs, she has something that she can leave behind. Her legacy is having saved Dolores. Because everything that happens from that point on leads to this other woman's journey and results in an outcome where she solves, that is Dolores does, her problem with Joe. And she definitely sees a solution on the horizon and a rekindled relationship, a new relationship with her daughter, all because of what Vera does. Ego integrity. So maybe Dolores Claiborne is a misnomer. Maybe it's a mistitled movie. Dolores is not the main character. It's not her story. This is Vera's story. And this is a story of a woman who achieves ego integrity and leaves this world with a legacy that we now know as Dolores Claiborne. Thoughts?
If she did that, why did she wait 8 years?
Well, maybe she was figuring out whether or not it was worth it to delve into the great unknown for this woman.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, it's a big choice to make. Kill myself so that this other woman can live. I mean, if we were on a life raft and having to think through this, there are some people who would not jump off that life raft if it meant saving another. This is a little bit more abstract than that. So this is not an easy decision to make. So maybe it took her 8 years to come to that conclusion. Was it 8?
Yeah. Well, she
I
said
love it.
the cop says that she wrote the will 8 years ago for Dolores. So I just assumed it was 8 years of.
I love it. That fits perfectly with the title of Eric Erickson's book. Right? 8 stages.
So sorry, you can go.
I was just going to say, I think it's completely coincidental, but that's a creepy coincidence that the number of years that Vera waited happens to have the number that is in the title of Eric Erickson's publication.
I just wanted to ask you your opinion on the cop who's like obsessed with Dolores. Do you think it's from like a misogynistic point of view? I feel like he's very against like her just as a woman more than a criminal. I don't know. He confused me a little.
Yeah, no, I think that's a distinct possibility. Of course, we cannot get any clarification on this unless we actually see into other cases that he's had and whether or not he treats his male perpetrators the same way. I think it's somewhat reasonable to suspect that he didn't know the extent to which Joe was abusing either Dolores or Selena. But there are other cases that he's been the lead detective on. And the true answer to our question lies in his treatment of the other perpetrators and whether or not there is consistency with which he treats his male versus female suspects. Because if we see that for his male suspects, he treats them the exact same way with the exact same scrutiny, this is just the way this particular detective goes about his business. But of course, if there's the antithesis that there are 2 rules that are applied, depending on whether you're a woman versus a man, clearly it's misogynistic It's gender based and biased, and it's incredibly unethical, if not illegal.
Mhm. I just like, I didn't know if it was like misogynistic, like gender based, or if it was just a grudge that it was like one of his first cases in the beginning when she killed her husband. And the chief officer or detective or lieutenant, I guess, basically told him to back down. And he was like now holding a grudge for Vera, or if it was something deeper.
For me, that would be at the very top of my list. I can actually see how someone starting a new career starts off like that and how that could stay with them.
Yeah.
I could definitely, and think of it as a physician, if your first surgical case dies on the table, if you have that untoward outcome, how that might stick with you. Now, how you react to that is completely up to your own personality. You could carry that around as a grudge, or you can learn from it. You know, in medicine, we have conferences called morbidity and mortality conferences, or M&M conferences, in which people learn from their mistakes to ensure that something as untoward as perioperative death is a learning experience and something that enhances your career and not bogs it down, not derails it like this particular detective. I don't think law enforcement has any such conference. But I think that's a big, not only is that's the impetus, what we see as the result has everything to do with him and how he reacts to this having been his first case. That's the real focus here, is what he brought to the equation and why he reacted the way he did and kept it as a grudge, and perhaps an anchor to his career rather than learning to grow from it. In the remaining time we have left, I just want to get back to Selena.
My thing is,
Yeah, please.
no, no. Okay, mine was relating to the detective. So if I don't know. I'm just thinking he might have had something other than the career issue with Dolores, because like it's you know, it's been a while, so I figure he would have another way to get his boost or his promotion or like his one good case, rather than holding that grudge against Dolores for like as long um as he did. So I don't know if maybe they might have known each other in the past. I'm not too sure, but it could be something that like fueled his anger.
All these are plausible, and as a psychiatrist, potential questions. These are, again, as a psychiatrist, especially in the clinical setting, you know, there's a significant amount of leeway in terms of the types of questions we'd ask. We want to get at the most private and intimate thoughts and feelings of our patients. So this is fair game to discuss this. Where's this coming from? You know, are these feelings that maybe you had for Dolores that because she was married were thwarted when you flirted? These are fair. And let me tell you that when you ask these types of questions in real life, you know, you do so because of due process. That's part of the psychiatric evaluation. Maybe not initially, but certainly something that you might get to in a psychotherapy session, for example. Then you're surprised when you actually uncover something. So sometimes these questions do lead to some answers. I think it's fair. I think just a heads up, kind of a heuristic moving forward, and what you might hear tomorrow in conversation. The medical students might focus on Selena. And if they do pick up on her being on multiple medications, there's a couple things to consider here. And it all stems from post-traumatic stress disorder. So one avenue here could be PTSD and what other illnesses have a significantly high rate of comorbidity. One is called borderline personality disorder. And whether or not Selena not only is struggling with PTSD, but also co-occurring borderline personality. One of the very common ways to manage borderline personality is by prescribing medication for symptomatic relief. So individuals with borderline have affective discontrol, mood swings, very rapid mood swings. So a couple of mood stabilizers. They could be subjected to stress-induced psychosis, so prescribe an antipsychotic. They could certainly have dysphoria, irritability, so antidepressant. So when we see multiple medications, 10, prescribed from several classes, 4 or 5, that might be supportive of there being a diagnosis of borderline personality, which would not be unheard of. Matter of fact, it could be likely when you look at the high rate of comorbidity that it has with PTSD. So that's something to consider here. The other thing to consider is remaining focused on post-traumatic stress disorder and how this condition is often misdiagnosed. That is, if Selena were to tell us, if Selena were to tell you as a practicing psychiatrist that there is no trauma history, you might actually misinterpret her panic attacks as being due to panic disorder. You may misinterpret her intrusive thoughts as being obsessive compulsive disorder. So you may put her on an SSRI for the OCD, but you might put her on 2 benzodiazepines for her panic, not recognizing that intrusive thoughts and panic-like symptoms are manifestations of PTSD. They're actually diagnostic criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. You might look at her irritability and her difficulty concentrating and her insomnia and her anhedonia as evidence of major depression. And when you start her on the antidepressant, you might find treatment resistance and therefore have her on 2 antidepressants. When all those symptoms, irritability, impaired concentration, anhedonia, and insomnia are also DSM criteria for PTSD. So you might misinterpret her hypervigilance, which again is a diagnostic criterion of post-traumatic stress disorder for paranoia, and you might put her on an antipsychotic. So the multiple medications might be the clinicians misattributing her symptoms of PTSD to other illnesses. So there's evidence of psychosis, depression, OCD, and panic. That could result in 4 different prescriptions. When all of those are diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder that you may have dismissed because she just told you there is no trauma, right? So that's another potential explanation as to why she could be on so many medications. She could be in this level of polypharmacy. So there's 2 scenarios that we might be tackling tomorrow when it comes to our CABnormal activity discussion and the observed polypharmacy. It might be just a misattribution of her PTSD symptoms, or if she is diagnosed with PTSD, how the medications are prescribed for the co-occurring condition called borderline personality disorder, which often results in the prescribing for symptomatic relief. Any closing questions or comments?
So, what was I gonna say? I totally slipped my mind. But basically, oh yeah, so if you're evaluating a patient and they don't mention that they have trauma, and so you end up prescribing all these things for like other co-occurring conditions, is there any way for you to know if there was trauma other than them telling you, or would you just have to go by what you're told?
So if I'm hearing from a patient that there are panic attacks, that there are intrusive thoughts, that there is anhedonia, irritability, impaired concentration, and insomnia, and there's some concern of paranoia / hypervigilance, one of the things that I might discuss is that these are all diagnostic criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. And if today you're reporting that you've had never experienced any trauma, one of the things I want us to keep in mind is that given the likelihood that there's PTSD because of this symptom constellation, you're not remembering the trauma is consistent with post-traumatic stress, because the more severe the trauma, A, the more likely you are to have these symptoms, and B, the less likely you are to remember the trauma itself. So let's keep PTSD in our differential. As part of our treatment planning, which of course would be medication management, let's also talk about getting you to a psychotherapist, and one that has an expertise in post-traumatic stress when individuals don't recall the event. So putting together that treatment plan. Now, if your patient hears this and says, no way, that's fine. They will provide either informed consent or refusal, but when they refuse care, please, it must be informed. They have to know what they're refusing. So articulating your thoughts as a clinician, what you think is going on, maintaining that high clinical index of suspicion, and relaying that to the patient provides them the necessary information that they could either then accept or refuse. All right, we'll end it there. We're up at 3 o'clock. We will see, if you're coming in tomorrow, I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll have probably a repeat of some aspect of this conversation then. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.